Marla Hammond considered herself the de facto guardian of Magnolia Oaks. Each morning, she rose early, pulled aside her floral-patterned curtains, and surveyed the neighborhood from her bay window. She believed it was her civic duty to watch for anything, even the slightest detail, that seemed out of place. Over time, her vigilant habits earned her a reputation as the local busybody, but Marla embraced the label. She convinced herself she was merely keeping Magnolia Oaks safe from unseen threats. When Tyrese Morgan moved into the house next door, a handsome property with carefully manicured shrubs and a newly painted exterior, Marla's curiosity was piqued. Tyrese was a black homeowner who drove a sleek car and appeared to live quite comfortably. At first, she simply noted his arrival, storing the fact away like every other tidbit she collected. But as days turned into weeks, her interest grew into an uneasy fixation. Why was someone so different from her living so well in Magnolia Oaks? Marla had no evidence of wrongdoing, yet an insidious thought took root: he must be hiding something. Often, she spotted Tyrese leaving for work in crisp shirts and polished shoes, driving off in his modern hybrid car. She told herself that his success was somehow suspicious. Perhaps he was engaged in shady deals or worse. Each time he waved at her cheerfully over the fence or offered a cordial hello, she responded with a stiff nod, her mind whirling with theories. She judged his friendly demeanor as too polished, maybe a cover for illicit activities. Marla was convinced that behind his polite exterior lurked a secret life begging to be exposed. Her investigations began innocently enough, observing the times he left and returned, noting any visitors he received. She jotted down license plate numbers of guests who stopped by, convinced that a pattern would emerge if only she looked long enough. The more her suspicion festered, the more her imagination conjured scenarios in which Tyrese was involved in clandestine operations. Whenever she saw him gardening or chatting with a delivery person, she strained her ears at the window, hoping to catch a snippet of incriminating conversation. If pressed, Marla would claim she was merely watching out for her community. In truth, she barely concealed the bias driving her paranoia. On more than one occasion, she mentioned to other neighbors, under the guise of neighborly concern, that it felt strange someone like Tyrese lived in such a nice house. A few neighbors shrugged off her comments or gently rebuked her insinuations, but no one fully grasped how her suspicions were growing like weeds in an untended yard. By the end of her initial fact-finding, Marla was certain she'd find proof of Tyrese's wrongdoing if she just searched hard enough. Little did she realize how far her obsession would soon carry her, or how her own prejudices would lead to a reckoning that would turn Magnolia Oaks upside down. As the days passed, Marla Hammond's fascination with her neighbor Tyrese Morgan evolved from casual curiosity into a zealous quest. She believed wholeheartedly that Tyrese's comfortable lifestyle and polished manners masked some hidden vice. The more she fixated on him, the more certain she grew that no one could be that clean, at least not by her skewed standards. Marla's initial snooping was confined to her own property lines. She'd stand by the hedge separating their yards, straining to eavesdrop on any phone calls Tyrese made while relaxing on his porch. She took note of the grocery deliveries that arrived at his doorstep, even timing the frequency of his dog walker's visits. Yet, despite her diligence, she uncovered nothing incriminating. Tyrese's routines seemed perfectly ordinary: work, home, a bit of gardening, the occasional friendly wave to neighbors. Undeterred by the lack of results, Marla hatched a bolder plan. She rationalized her next step by telling herself that if Tyrese truly had nothing to hide, a closer look wouldn't matter. After all, if she found no evidence of wrongdoing, she could finally relax. One afternoon, while Tyrese was at work, Marla wandered to the side of his house, feigning interest in the bougainvillea vines creeping over the fence. To her astonishment, she spotted a small metal lockbox affixed discreetly near the back door. A key safe, she realized, most likely containing a spare key. Convinced that her suspicions justified her actions, Marla lingered until she was certain no one was watching. Heart pounding, she fumbled with the lockbox's keypad. A half-remembered snippet of conversation drifted through her mind: Tyrese once mentioning his favorite number was 1973, a random personal tidbit overheard from across the fence. She tapped it in, and to her disbelief, the tiny door swung open, revealing a single silver house key. At that moment, she felt a rush of both triumph and trepidation. Even as her hands trembled, she pocketed the key, telling herself this was for the greater good. That evening, she waited until darkness shrouded Magnolia Oaks. Slipping out her back door, she crept into Tyrese's yard, ignoring the twinge of guilt and the adrenaline surge flooding her veins. When she reached his back entrance, the key slid smoothly into the lock. A click, and the door swung open. Marla froze, listening for an alarm, expecting sirens or some immediate repercussion. But the house remained silent, cloaked in shadow and the faint hum of an air conditioner. She stepped inside, flicking on her phone's flashlight. Her heart hammered in her chest. She moved through the living room, scanning the shelves for anything suspicious, documents, receipts, maybe an odd stash of money. She checked the kitchen drawers, rummaged lightly through the guest bedroom closet. Everywhere she looked, she found mundane normalcy, neatly arranged books, a modest wine rack, a living room adorned with tasteful artwork. It all struck her as unremarkable, which only deepened her conviction that Tyrese had carefully hidden whatever secrets he harbored. After a hurried tour, she retreated the way she came, adrenaline still coursing. She locked the door behind her, returning the key to its safe. Though she found nothing obviously incriminating, Marla refused to let go of her theory. In her mind, this was just step one. She vowed to return, convinced she would eventually uncover the proof she needed. The line between neighborly vigilance and criminal intrusion had blurred, but Marla was too far down the path to notice or care. For her, the ends justified the means, and she believed she was protecting Magnolia Oaks from a danger only she could see. Tyrese Morgan first noticed something amiss on a Saturday evening, just after returning from a quick trip to the grocery store. He tossed his keys on the kitchen counter, opened the fridge to store his perishables, and sensed a subtle shift in the atmosphere, an intangible feeling that someone had been inside his home. His front door was locked, windows secure, and everything looked superficially in order. Yet a nagging unease took root. He brushed off the sensation initially, chalking it up to stress. But over the next few days, small anomalies began piling up. At first it was trivial, a stack of mail on the living room table seemed shuffled through, an old picture frame on the mantel was slightly askew, and a kitchen drawer felt out of place as if rummaged. Tyrese tried to rationalize each instance. Maybe he'd moved the frame absent-mindedly, or perhaps he forgot how he arranged the mail. But the sense of intrusion wouldn't fade. One morning, he discovered something more overtly wrong. His spare phone charger that normally lived in the top desk drawer was lying on his bedroom dresser instead. He had no memory of leaving it there. The realization unsettled him enough to mention it to a friend during lunch. "I know it sounds paranoid," he confessed, "but I swear things aren't where I left them." His friend suggested double-checking the locks and possibly installing a basic home security system for peace of mind. Tyrese mulled it over. The idea of being watched or having someone slip in undetected felt like a scene from a thriller movie, but the mounting evidence was hard to ignore. He tested his front and back doors, finding them locked and apparently uncompromised. There were no signs of forced entry. So if someone was entering, they had a key. That thought alone sent a chill through him. Meanwhile, across the yard, Marla Hammond was mired in her own growing obsession. She'd returned to Tyrese's home multiple times, rummaging through his belongings whenever she believed he wouldn't notice. Yet each time, she uncovered no red flags, no suspicious financial records, no hidden contraband, nothing that suggested any wrongdoing. Her repeated failure to find evidence only fueled her conviction that Tyrese had perfected the art of concealment. As days turned to weeks, Marla's paranoia intensified. She interpreted every mundane event as a potential clue: a parcel delivered to Tyrese's doorstep at an odd hour, a new car pulling into his driveway for a short visit, or glimpses of him typing on his laptop at night through a half-closed curtain. In her twisted logic, these were breadcrumbs leading to the revelation that he was up to no good. She was certain he had secrets locked away, secrets she was determined to expose. Yet her repeated break-ins began leaving traces she failed to conceal. A hair out of place, a document misfiled, a cabinet door closed differently. Tyrese, already on edge, noticed these minute details. In his gut, he knew someone had been inside. Fear mingled with indignation. Why would anyone target him? He'd done nothing to provoke hostility. If it was a burglar, they hadn't stolen anything. The entire situation was bizarre. Determined to regain a sense of security, Tyrese took his friend's advice. He purchased a discreet security camera kit from an electronics store, the kind that could be installed without drilling or complicated wiring. Over one quiet afternoon, he set up the small camera in his living room, tucked into a corner disguised by a potted plant. Another he placed near the back door, angled to capture whoever might enter. Both cameras synced to an app on his phone, enabling him to watch real-time footage or review recordings. For a few nights, he slept only fitfully, mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Maybe it was a stranger scoping out the property. Perhaps a resentful acquaintance he'd unknowingly offended. The idea that it could be a neighbor never crossed his mind. He believed in the friendly ethos of Magnolia Oaks. Even if he and Marla rarely exchanged more than polite nods, he assumed everyone in the neighborhood adhered to a basic code of respect. As Tyrese grew more cautious, Marla dove deeper into her delusion. She reasoned that if Tyrese felt the presence of an intruder, he might slip up. Maybe in his haste to hide the truth, he'd leave out incriminating documents or make a phone call in panic. She occasionally saw him walking in circles in his backyard, phone in hand, and fantasized that he was conversing with nefarious associates. With each passing day, her mission to protect Magnolia Oaks from a perceived threat grew more urgent. When Tyrese finally activated the cameras, he felt a sliver of relief. No longer would he rely solely on suspicion or the odd out-of-place object. Now, if someone dared enter, he'd have concrete proof. In the back of his mind, he feared what might happen if the intruder was desperate or dangerous. But living under constant worry was no way to be. At least this way, he could face the truth, whatever it might be. And put an end to the unnerving uncertainty. Unbeknownst to him, that truth was closer than he could have imagined. All it would take was one quiet night and another misguided intrusion from Marla for Tyrese's suspicion and her paranoia to collide in an irreparable explosion. It was nearly midnight when Marla Hammond approached Tyrese Morgan's back door yet again. She wore dark jeans and a plain gray hoodie, the hood drawn low over her face as if she were a cat burglar. Nervous adrenaline prickled along her skin. She assured herself this was necessary. Magnolia Oaks depended on her vigilance, and in her eyes, Tyrese's unblemished facade was too perfect to be real. Sliding the borrowed key from her pocket, she turned it in the lock. The door opened smoothly, just as it had before. She stepped inside, gently pushing the door shut behind her to avoid alerting any neighbors to the faint glow of light from within. With the dim beam of her flashlight guiding her, she moved through the living room. It was as tidy and unremarkable as ever. The house felt still, almost too still, which heightened her sense of being watched. She glanced around, seeing only familiar furniture. Books aligned neatly on the coffee table, a stack of unopened mail on the sideboard, these were the mundane details she'd come to expect. Irritated that everything looked legitimate, Marla pressed forward, deciding to check upstairs for any hidden compartments. Perhaps Tyrese stashed his evidence in an attic or behind a false wall. What she failed to notice was the small camera perched near a leafy potted plant in a corner of the room. Its lens, nearly invisible in the dark, captured her every move. Tyrese, unable to sleep, was browsing a news site on his phone in bed when he received a notification, motion detected in living room camera. His pulse quickened. Heart hammering, he tapped the alert, and a live video feed appeared on his screen. He stared in disbelief as a figure in a hoodie carefully stepped around his living room. A wave of indignation and fear washed over him. Someone was actually inside his house. He toggled for the second camera's feed near the back door, verifying the intruder's entrance. No forced entry. The door opened as if the person had the key. That hammered home the disturbing reality that it wasn't just random petty crime. This was targeted. Summoning courage, Tyrese dialed 911. He whispered to the dispatcher, explaining that a trespasser was in his home. Every second felt like an hour. Would they rummage around? Would they flee before the police arrived? The dispatcher assured him officers were en route. In the meantime, Tyrese watched the live feed, refusing to cower. The camera's vantage caught the intruder creeping closer to a hallway. Suddenly, Tyrese realized a crucial detail: the figure was oddly familiar in build. And from a slight tilt of the flashlight's glow reflecting on the figure's face, he could see it was a woman. A jolt of recognition ran through him. It looked like Marla from next door. He hardly knew her beyond polite nods, but that silhouette and her profile were unmistakable. Shock mingled with betrayal. Why would his neighbor be sneaking around his home? He forced himself to remain calm, whispering updates to the dispatcher. "It's my neighbor. I recognize her. She's rummaging through my stuff." He felt an odd wave of relief at having actual evidence. The swirling paranoia of the past few weeks made sense now. Someone had indeed been letting themselves in at night, and that someone was the woman who lived just a fence line away. Marla, for her part, stayed oblivious to the camera's presence. She tiptoed into a small home office, flipping through documents, scanning for something, anything, that confirmed Tyrese's guilt. Yet once again, all she found were routine bills, personal letters, and innocuous notes. Frustration welled up. She was sure Tyrese was no ordinary homeowner. So why did every corner of his home seem so normal? Outside, the distant wail of approaching sirens cut through the quiet street. Tyrese heard them. The dispatcher informed him officers were close. Meanwhile, Marla froze, hearing the same sound. A spike of panic stabbed her gut. Were they heading here? She never counted on being caught. Instinct urged her to flee. She sprinted back down the stairs, across the living room, and reached the back door. But as she turned the knob to slip out, bright beams of flashlights flooded through the windows, and the pounding of footsteps approached the house. She dashed back into the living room, desperate for a hiding place, but found none that would keep her safe for long. The cameras tracked her every frantic move. Moments later, the back door slammed open, and two uniformed officers stepped inside, guns drawn but lowered when they realized the suspect was not armed. "Police," one shouted. "Hands where we can see them." Marla's chest heaved with ragged breaths. She raised her trembling hands, understanding there was no escape. The second officer stepped forward, while Tyrese, accompanied by more officers, entered from the front. His eyes locked with hers, equal parts fear and anger swirling in his expression. "Marla?" Tyrese's voice was tight. "What are you doing?" She had no coherent answer. Her illusions of righteous espionage evaporated under the glare of reality. With the camera footage on Tyrese's phone, the officers quickly pieced together the situation. She had a key she wasn't supposed to have, and she had entered multiple times without permission. The realization of her predicament finally sank in. Her reckless crusade to expose Tyrese had ended in a humiliating scene, caught red-handed, ironically, with absolutely nothing incriminating to show for her efforts. In that charged moment, the foundations of Magnolia Oak's neighborly facade shattered. Marla's actions were no product of genuine concern but of unfounded bias and personal obsession. And now, she stood fully exposed, the police poised to unravel the story she'd so carefully concocted in her own mind. Even after Marla Hammond's late-night intrusion, Tyrese Morgan struggled to regain his sense of security. The shock of discovering that his neighbor had been repeatedly entering his home left him uneasy in ways he couldn't shake. Although the police had arrived in time to confront Marla, they'd allowed her to go home pending further investigation, given that she appeared unarmed and no immediate charges were officially filed that night. Tyrese's footage was invaluable evidence, but bureaucratic steps slowed the process of formal arrest. Still, he wanted immediate protection from any possibility of Marla returning. The morning after her break-in, Tyrese called a locksmith to change all the locks on his doors. He explained to the locksmith that he'd lost trust in the existing ones, though he refrained from detailing the entire saga. The locksmith arrived promptly, installing a top-tier security system with brand-new deadbolts and a specialized keypad lock for the back door. As Tyrese watched the locksmith at work, he found momentary relief. Each drilled-in screw, each replaced metal plate symbolized a fresh barrier against invasion. Yet, a part of him bristled at the necessity. He'd chosen Magnolia Oaks for its reputation of friendly neighbors and safe streets. Now, he was forced to reinforce his home as though he resided in a high-risk zone. Across the fence, Marla seethed in an entirely different type of turmoil. After the police let her off with a stern warning to stay away until further notice, she retreated to her house, nursing a bruised ego. In her mind, she hadn't failed, Tyrese was simply more cunning than she'd anticipated. The moment she glimpsed the locksmith's van and realized Tyrese was fortifying his home, her anger flared anew. She interpreted the lock change as a deliberate provocation, a sign that he was doubling down on whatever she was convinced he was hiding. Peeking from behind her blinds, Marla snapped photos on her phone of the locksmith's truck parked in Tyrese's driveway. She texted them to a few close acquaintances, spinning a tale of how her dangerous neighbor was making suspicious modifications to his property. One friend suggested she drop the matter, warning her that she was overstepping. Another friend, equally swayed by Marla's paranoia, encouraged her to keep watch. Despite being caught red-handed, Marla felt oddly validated. She believed she was right about Tyrese, and that he'd only changed the locks because he worried she was close to discovering his secret. The logic was twisted, but it fueled her resolve. Each turn of the screwdriver that she heard echoing across the yard seemed to reaffirm her misguided narrative: Tyrese had something to hide. Meanwhile, Tyrese's phone buzzed with supportive messages from friends who'd heard the story. Many urged him to press charges without hesitation. He was torn. Part of him wanted to see justice served for Marla's violation of his privacy, but another part found the legal system daunting and sought a swift resolution without a long court battle. He was also sensitive to the fact that he and Marla still lived mere steps from each other, separated by a shared fence. Once the locksmith finished, Tyrese carefully tested each new lock. They felt sturdier, and the digital keypad beeped reassuringly when he keyed in his fresh code. He thanked the locksmith and watched him drive away, then wandered through the house, verifying that everything was secure. The place felt a little different, still his home, but now layered with an undercurrent of vigilance. That evening, as dusk settled over Magnolia Oaks, Tyrese tried to resume some semblance of normal life. He cooked a simple dinner, read a few chapters of a book, and attempted to relax. Yet he found himself checking the window often, scanning for any sign of Marla. Through the blinds, he could see her lights were on, a shadow occasionally crossing in front of her window. Shortly after 9 p.m., the motion sensor light at his back door flicked on, startling Tyrese. Heart pounding, he checked the feed from his security cameras. To his relief, it was just a stray cat wandering the yard. Nonetheless, his nerves were frayed, and he realized how drastically this situation had altered his daily routine. Even though Marla had been caught in the act, she still roamed free next door. No official order prevented her from venturing onto his property again, only a stern warning from the authorities. Tyrese felt an unsettling vulnerability, anger stirring at the notion that he, the victim, was the one feeling anxious while the perpetrator faced minimal immediate repercussions. Yet, amid the frustration, he clung to the knowledge that his new locks and security measures placed an extra layer of protection around him. He'd done everything he could to secure his home from future intrusions. The rest, he hoped, would be handled by the legal system once the police processed his footage. In the meantime, he vowed to stay alert and keep recording any suspicious activity. Unbeknownst to him, the lock change he viewed as a prudent measure would soon incite Marla into taking an even more drastic step, one that could endanger not just Tyrese's peace of mind, but also his safety. For several days, Marla Hammond fumed at the sight of Tyrese Morgan's new locks. In her warped sense of logic, his decision to secure his home was an affront, a blatant attempt to conceal whatever she believed he was hiding. Late at night, she paced her living room, replaying the events that had transpired, her unauthorized entries, the moment Tyrese's camera caught her in the act, and the police's stern but temporary reprieve. It was all too humiliating, and humiliation turned her paranoia into fervor. One morning, an idea flitted through her mind. An idea that she latched onto with unsettling enthusiasm. If Tyrese was changing the locks, perhaps he was, in fact, tampering with the property in some illicit way. She recalled how some criminals replace door hardware or windows to store contraband or modify entrances for shady dealings. Fueled by her unwavering conviction that Tyrese was up to no good, Marla decided to cast him as the suspect in the eyes of law enforcement before he could expose her further. She spent hours crafting a narrative to present to the police. She told herself it was justified, a matter of public safety. After all, if Tyrese truly was a criminal, calling the authorities would confirm her suspicions and exonerate her actions. She practiced her story in the mirror, carefully omitting the fact that she'd broken into his home multiple times and instead framing the lock change as a suspicious act that compromised neighborhood security. By noon, her adrenaline peaked. She snatched her phone off the table, dialed the non-emergency line, and asked to be transferred to an officer. When she was connected, she feigned a strained, anxious tone. "Officer," she began, "I live in Magnolia Oaks, and there's a man on my street who's been acting very odd. He recently changed his locks, and I suspect he's breaking in, to his own house, yes, but in a suspicious manner. He might be tampering with something inside. It's not normal." The officer on the other end sounded measured, likely used to fielding unusual complaints. "Ma'am, are you reporting a burglary in progress?" they asked. "Has he forced entry or caused damage?" Marla hesitated. "Well, I've seen him going in and out at odd hours, and the new lock it's definitely not standard. He's also had strange deliveries. Look, I just think something is off. Could you please send someone to check it out?" Though the officer was non-committal, Marla pressed on, doubling down on her vague insinuations that Tyrese was a threat to the neighborhood. When the call ended, she felt a surge of triumph. She believed that by framing the situation this way, she'd shift suspicion onto him instead of herself. If the police arrived with questions about the lock change, Tyrese would look guilty. She also hoped that by casting doubt, any pending investigations into her own actions might stall. Not content to wait passively, Marla grabbed her jacket and stepped outside, crossing her yard to stand near the fence separating her property from Tyrese's. She peered over, scanning for any sign of him. The day was quiet, and Tyrese's car was gone, a sign he was likely at work. Perfect, she thought. The officers would hopefully show up soon, catch him by surprise, and discover whatever hidden wrongdoing she was certain he harbored. The afternoon sun rose high, hours trickling by without police presence. Impatient, Marla paced her living room, occasionally peeking through her blinds at Tyrese's house. Each passing minute without sirens tested her resolve. When dusk rolled in, Tyrese returned from work, and still no patrol car circled the block. Finally, after dinner, Marla's phone rang. An unknown number. She answered eagerly, hoping it was the police ready to confirm her suspicions. Instead, she heard a measured voice. "Ms. Hammond, this is Officer Richardson following up on your call. We've looked into your report, and at this time, we see no direct evidence of criminal activity. Do you have anything more concrete to share?" Marla's frustration boiled over. "What do you mean, no evidence? He replaced his locks. That's not normal unless he's hiding something," she insisted. Officer Richardson paused. "Lock replacements are legal, ma'am, and not uncommon if a homeowner feels the need for better security. Unless he's done damage or forcibly broken in, we have no grounds to investigate further." Stunned into silence, Marla stammered a few half-formed protests before the officer politely ended the call. Her plan to vilify Tyrese had hit a wall. Without tangible proof, the authorities had no reason to treat him as a suspect. Meanwhile, the real cause for suspicion, her trespassing, remained squarely on her own shoulders. Seething, she found herself in a maddening loop of resentment. Tyrese was the one who changed the locks, presumably to keep her out, and now it was she who looked like a meddling neighbor with an overactive imagination. Her attempts to flip the script had failed spectacularly. Yet, in her distorted worldview, this outcome only deepened her conviction that Tyrese was outsmarting everyone, including law enforcement. As night fell on Magnolia Oaks, Marla's mind raced with increasingly desperate plots. If the police wouldn't intervene just because of her suspicions, perhaps she'd have to force the issue. After all, she believed wholeheartedly that something sinister lurked behind Tyrese's calm exterior, and she was determined to prove it, no matter the cost. 2 days passed before Marla Hammond decided to double down on her strategy. The police's refusal to act on her vague suspicions had only inflamed her conviction that she was the last line of defense for Magnolia Oaks. If they wouldn't come on her terms, she'd force a situation where they couldn't ignore the call. All she needed was the right trigger to get them there, something dramatic enough to demand a serious response. Late one afternoon, she noticed Tyrese Morgan pulling into his driveway. He carried a few shopping bags from the local hardware store, likely more home improvement supplies. The sight roused her paranoia once again, more modifications to his property, or so she assumed. She watched from her window, making sure to note the brand names on the bags as he unloaded them. Then an idea struck her: if the police were called to a direct confrontation, they'd have to show up in person. And if they were on the scene, she could craft her accusations in real time. Seizing the moment, Marla slipped out her front door and marched straight toward Tyrese's driveway, ignoring the startled look he gave her. Before he could greet her, she jabbed a finger at the bags. "Still up to your sneaky renovations, I see," she said, voice tight with insinuation. Tyrese set the bags down, confusion etched on his face. "I'm just doing some basic fixes around the house. Do you have a problem with that?" "Yes, I do," Marla retorted, crossing her arms. "You're always installing something new, changing your locks, messing with your property. It's suspicious." Tyrese blinked. "You realize I had to change those locks because you were caught entering my home without permission, right?" His words cut, a reminder that she'd lost the upper hand once. But Marla refused to show weakness. Instead, she raised her voice, aiming for anyone nearby to hear. "You're the one who's suspicious. Hiding who knows what behind these renovations. Don't think I won't call the police again." Already on edge from the near-miss break-in incident, Tyrese felt his temper surge. But he forced himself to remain calm. "Go ahead. I have video evidence of everything that's been happening. The last time you called them, they dismissed your claims. I'm not the criminal here." Marla's eyes flashed. This was exactly the heated moment she wanted to provoke. She whipped out her phone and dialed 911 right there in front of Tyrese. In a voice crackling with feigned alarm, she reported, "There's a disturbance at my neighbor's house, he's threatening me, and he's tampering with the property. Please send officers immediately." Tyrese's jaw tightened as he overheard her warped version of events. "You're lying," he said softly, disbelieving how brazen she was. "I haven't threatened you, nor am I doing anything illegal." Marla ignored him, continuing her call until the dispatcher confirmed officers were en route. She ended the call and glared at Tyrese, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. "They'll finally see what you're up to," she proclaimed. Within 15 minutes, 2 squad cars arrived on the scene, lights flashing. A pair of officers stepped out, surveying the tense standoff. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, began peeking from porches and windows. One officer, a tall woman with a confident stride, approached Marla. "Ma'am, did you call us?" Marla nodded, launching into her prepared spiel. Yes, officer, I caught him messing around with suspicious hardware. He's been harassing me. I believe he's building something illegal or hiding contraband. She gestured theatrically at Tyrese's house. Look at all those modifications. Wait, Tyrese interjected, stepping forward. Officer, my name is Tyrese Morgan. I'm the homeowner. I haven't done anything but make improvements and change locks to secure my home. She's been harassing me, not the other way around. He pointed to Marla. She's the same person who broke into my house multiple times. I've got footage if you need it. The second officer, a stocky man with a calm demeanor, glanced at Tyrese. You have video evidence of her breaking in? He asked, exchanging a quick look with his partner. Tyrese nodded, taking out his phone. Yes. I can show you right now. Please understand, I've done nothing wrong. She's the one who's been trespassing. Marla spluttered. He's lying, officer. That's just some trick video he probably staged. The tall officer sighed, clearly sensing the tension. Let's settle down, she said, looking from one to the other. Ma'am, you claim you witnessed suspicious behavior. Sir, you say you have camera proof of her intrusions. We'll need to see that evidence. While the onlookers whispered among themselves, Tyrese unlocked his phone and tapped a few icons, pulling up the recorded clips. The officers stood in close, watching the grainy nighttime footage that showed Marla letting herself in with a key and roaming Tyrese's living room. A hush fell as the incriminating images played, each frame a silent rebuke to her accusations. Marla's face grew pale. That can't be, she stammered. There must be an explanation. He's setting me up, the stocky officer raised an eyebrow. It's pretty clear who's trespassing here, ma'am. And we have a record of you calling 911 on him before, with no basis. Defiance flickered in Marla's eyes. She opened her mouth, searching for a fresh lie, but the presence of so many witnesses, neighbors, the officers, and Tyrese himself, left her cornered. The tall officer motioned for them both to remain calm while they conferred with dispatch, checking any existing reports on file. As more neighbors gathered around, some whispered in shock. Word had spread that Marla was caught in Tyrese's house not long ago. Now, seeing her again pointing fingers, it was hard to give her the benefit of the doubt. The tall officer looked back at Tyrese. Mr. Morgan, do you want to file an official complaint regarding her attempts to enter your property and these false accusations? Tyrese considered it, eyes locked on Marla. Yes, he said, voice steady. I'm done living in fear. She's crossed too many lines. Marla inhaled sharply, reality sinking in. No longer was she the self-proclaimed heroine fighting a phantom threat. In the eyes of the law, she was the one with questionable motives, potentially facing charges for her actions. As the cluster of neighbors looked on, the two officers guided Marla Hammond and Tyrese Morgan to one side of his driveway, away from the growing throng. Flashlights and phone screens lit up the evening gloom, capturing the tension in shaky videos. Wordlessly, Marla tried to reposition herself in front of Tyrese, as though still claiming moral high ground. But the officers kept them separate, each with their own space to speak. The tall officer, whose name tag read Sergeant Lopez, cleared her throat. Mr. Morgan, you mentioned you have further evidence and some documents regarding Ms. Hammond's history. Could you show us what you have? Tyrese nodded, swallowing hard. He pulled out his phone again, this time flipping through pictures and screenshots. A few nights ago, after I caught her breaking in on camera, I did some research, he explained. It turns out Ms. Hammond has a criminal background, there are records of probation for property-related offenses. I also have more footage of her rummaging through my living room and kitchen on multiple occasions. As he spoke, he handed his phone to Sergeant Lopez. The second officer, who introduced himself as Officer Randall, listened closely. Tyrese had compiled screenshots from public court documents he found online, referencing Marla Hammond in burglary and theft incidents from a neighboring county a few years prior. He'd also saved local news articles mentioning the same name, linking her to trespassing charges. Marla's cheeks burned with anger and embarrassment. She'd counted on her checkered past remaining unknown in Magnolia Oaks, hoping to keep her old record separate from her present life. Now, it spilled out in front of everyone, casting her vigilant crusade in a different, incriminating light. "This is outrageous," she hissed, crossing her arms defensively. "He's dredging up ancient history that has nothing to do with what's happening now. That was a misunderstanding." But the record on Tyrese's phone told a different story. One article described how Marla had been arrested for entering a vacant house that wasn't her own, claiming she was just investigating suspicious activity. Another referenced stolen property found in her possession. Coupled with the newly recorded videos of her inside Tyrese's home, a pattern of behavior began to emerge, one that contradicted any attempt at painting her as a concerned neighbor. Sergeant Lopez flipped through the screenshots, her expression grim. Then she turned to Marla. "Ma'am, you didn't mention this history when you called us multiple times about Mr. Morgan. Why is that?" Marla's voice faltered. "Because it's irrelevant. I served my probation, I have every right to live here. And he's still suspicious." At that, the officer looked unimpressed. "We're not here to discuss your right to live anywhere. We're here to address the repeated allegations you've made against Mr. Morgan and the evidence that suggests you've been trespassing and potentially violating your probation terms." Tyrese, hands trembling with a mixture of relief and anger, spoke up. "I never wanted this. I moved to Magnolia Oaks for peace and a sense of community. Instead, I've been dealing with her constant accusations and break-ins. She even tried to spin it that I was the criminal. I'm just tired of living like I have a target on my back." Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Several neighbors who had once humored Marla's watchful eye were now grappling with the extent of her obsession. They whispered among themselves, recalling how often she'd spouted baseless rumors about Tyrese. Some recalled receiving texts from her, warning them about him in coded, racially charged language, an uncomfortable reflection of biases that now stood exposed in the harsh glare of the police lights. Sergeant Lopez gestured for calm. "We'll need formal statements from both of you," she said, eyeing Marla's defensive posture. "Ms. Hammond, do you have any solid evidence to back your claims that Mr. Morgan is involved in anything illegal?" Marla remained silent, unwilling or unable to produce anything except stammering references to his house repairs, lock changes, and gut feelings. Officer Randall chimed in, "Ma'am, we deal in facts. If you can't show us actual proof, and Mr. Morgan has video placing you in his home without consent, the situation is clear." Realizing the precariousness of her position, Marla switched tactics. He's harassing me," she tried, her voice thick with desperation. "He's tarnishing my name, looking up my old records. This is character assassination." Tyrese's frustration flared. "You broke into my house, multiple times. That's not harassment on my part. That's self-defense. I had every right to investigate who was targeting me." Officer Randall gently took hold of Marla's arm, guiding her a step away. "Ms. Hammond, I'm going to have to ask you some questions about your involvement in those entries. We also need to check on the status of your previous probation or supervised release, to ensure you haven't violated any conditions." A hush fell on the crowd. Some neighbors discreetly filmed with their phones. Others just stared, mouths agape. Marla's once commanding tone wilted, replaced by a trembling indignation she could no longer direct at Tyrese alone. She realized the longer she stood there, the more it became clear she was the aggressor. Sergeant Lopez took Tyrese aside. "Mr. Morgan, you can formally press charges if you wish. The evidence you've shown us is enough to consider arrest. Are you prepared to do that?" He hesitated, a swirl of conflicting emotions in his eyes. "I just want her to stop," he whispered, exhaustion clear in his voice. But the memory of her rummaging through his home galvanized him. "Yes," he finally said. I want to press charges for trespassing, harassment, and anything else that applies. Satisfied, the sergeant nodded, signaling to her partner. Officer Randall produced a small notepad, scribbling down details, while another officer on scene radioed in for instructions regarding an individual with a prior record. At the mention of verifying her background, Marla's composure cracked further. Caught in the harsh light of the patrol car headlights, Marla's face reflected both fear and defiance. She'd staked her entire sense of purpose on unveiling Tyrese's non-existent crimes, only to find her past and present twisted into one inescapable truth. The very illusions she'd woven around Tyrese now ensnared her, leaving no clear path to redemption. Within minutes, the quiet street of Magnolia Oaks transformed into a scene of official procedure. Additional patrol cars arrived, lights flickering red and blue across the manicured lawns and picket fences. A sense of finality hung in the air, as though the neighborhood itself recognized that this was the moment everything would be laid bare. Sergeant Lopez consulted her radio, confirming Marla Hammond's prior record. The dispatch operator confirmed that Marla was under a form of supervised release, with strict conditions against trespassing or any illegal activity. In essence, her repeated entries into Tyrese Morgan's home breached those conditions. That alone provided grounds for an immediate arrest. As the updates filtered through, Officer Randall approached Marla. Her eyes darted around, as if seeking an escape, but all routes were blocked by the uniformed presence and the watchful eyes of neighbors. "Ms. Hammond," Randall said, tone neutral but firm, "we have confirmed you are on supervised release, and your actions here violate those terms. We are taking you into custody." Marla's mouth opened in silent protest. Any attempt at denial would be futile with the clear video evidence Tyrese had provided, and the revealed details of her criminal history. Resigned, she allowed the officer to place handcuffs around her wrists, the metallic click echoing through the hush. A wave of shock rippled through the onlookers. Though many had suspected something was off about Marla's fervent intrusions, few expected it to end so dramatically. Tyrese stood to one side, arms crossed, relief and sorrow mixing in his gaze. He never wished harm on Marla, but the intrusion on his privacy and her relentless accusations left him no choice but to press charges. Watching her being escorted to the back of a patrol car, he felt a pang of empathy overshadowed by relief. Maybe now he could finally live in peace. Sergeant Lopez approached Tyrese one final time, confirming the details of his testimony and reminding him to expect follow-up paperwork. "We'll contact you if we need anything further, Mr. Morgan. For now, this should put an end to her harassment." Tyrese nodded, quiet gratitude in his voice as he thanked her. Neighbors watched as Marla was driven away, whispers of disbelief and condemnation passing among them. It was a jarring climax to weeks of tension. In a single night, the veneer of neighborly harmony cracked, revealing a story of obsession, bias, and invasive trespassing. Even those who once gave Marla the benefit of the doubt now recognized the dangerous scope of her actions. For Tyrese, the arrest signaled more than just the end of harassment. It was also a stark testament to how prejudice, left unchecked, could escalate into outright criminal behavior. Though rattled by the ordeal, he took a measured breath and reminded himself that the worst appeared over. Little did he know, there was still one last piece of the puzzle waiting to be revealed, a final confirmation of Marla's trespasses that would seal her fate beyond any doubt. In the ensuing days, Tyrese Morgan found himself surprisingly calm. The immediate threat was gone. Marla Hammond, now in custody, could no longer disrupt his life. Yet the police requested he visit the station to finalize his statement and provide any further evidence that might substantiate the charges. He obliged, hoping to leave no stone unturned. When he arrived, Sergeant Lopez guided him to a modest interview room. "We understand you have more documentation," she prompted, opening a file on the table. Tyrese nodded, pulling a USB drive from his coat pocket. "Yes," he said, voice steady. "It's a compilation of older security footage, some from weeks ago. I recently retrieved it from cloud backup." He plugged the USB into a police laptop, and they watched another set of clips. These older recordings showed Marla entering his home multiple times, once during broad daylight, brazenly rifling through his kitchen drawers, another time rummaging in a closet. The videos lacked audio, but the images were damningly clear. She was no good Samaritan. She was an intruder, rummaging around in search of something she never found. Sergeant Lopez and Officer Randall exchanged grim glances. Combined with the first set of clips, plus her prior record and the recent confrontation, Marla's guilt was irrefutable. This cements the case, Lopez declared, noting the timestamps that showed a pattern of illegal entries predating the night Tyrese had caught her red-handed. Tyrese exhaled, a quiet sense of vindication filling him. For weeks, he'd felt powerless against Marla's suspicions. She had tried to weaponize the law against him, calling the police over fabricated claims. Now, in the face of these videos, the truth was undeniable. Her crusade against him stemmed from her own biases and a misguided belief in wrongdoing where none existed. Lopez escorted Tyrese out, thanking him for his cooperation. "With everything you've provided, Ms. Hammond's violation of her supervised release is certain. The court will have little doubt about her intentions," she said. Tyrese nodded appreciatively. Outside, the crisp morning air greeted him, and he felt a subtle relief lighten his chest. He gazed at the traffic passing along the city street, realizing how a single neighbor's paranoia had nearly derailed his sense of safety. Yet he also recognized that justice, at least in this instance, had prevailed. Back in Magnolia Oaks, the rumor subsided as facts emerged. Neighbors spoke of how prejudice and obsession drove Marla to cross lines she could never uncross. Tyrese, though shaken, found solace in the outpouring of support from those around him. He resumed his routine, taking out the trash, watering his flowers, knowing he no longer had to glance over his shoulder. As he walked up to his front door, keys in hand, Tyrese paused. The old lock was gone, replaced by a robust new deadbolt, a symbol, he reflected, of the stand he took to protect his home and his dignity. In that small victory, he found the final chapter to a saga rooted in bias and fear, ending instead with truth and resolution.